Mejia. I am the president of the Multiracial Biracial Student Alliance and the Multi-Heritage Programming Coordinator for the Center for Identity and Inclusion at CU Denver. So today is the first session of our Exoticism and Fetishization series, specifically focusing on the violence that is produced from these concepts. I'd like to start off by reading a land acknowledgement. So acknowledging that we reside in the homelands of Indigenous peoples is an important step in recognizing the history and the original stewards of these lands. Land acknowledgements must extend far beyond words. The United States has worked hard to erase the narratives of Indigenous peoples over time. Land acknowledgement statements can help remind us of the history, the contributions, and the sacrifices Native peoples have made. We honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. This area, specifically the confluence of the Platte-Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 Indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, Paiute, Zuni, Hopi, among others. We must recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and as these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard. Remember the ties these nations still have to their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and pay our respect to the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Let us also give thanks to all tribal nations and ancestors of this place. Now, this land acknowledgement was provided by the Director of American Indian Student Services in CII at the Center for Identity and Inclusion, Gracie Redshirt Tyon. But I would also like to acknowledge the removal of BIPOC communities to create the Auraria campus, which houses Community College of Denver, Metro, and CU Denver. Today, I would also like to go over a few community guidelines that will kind of shape our discussion, and I'll be putting these in the chat as well, so if you'd like to reference them, you're welcome to do that. The first is, I will lean into conversations. I will believe everyone is doing their best. I will critique ideas, not people. I will use I statements. I will accept a lack of closure. I will not make assumptions about other people's identities. I will take care of myself and take breaks if I need to. I will agree what is shared here stays here, and what is learned here leaves here. So once again, I'll be putting these in the chat. And once again, this is a collaboration with the Phoenix Center Asian American Student Services and the Multiracial Biracial Student Alliance. Excuse me. So let me put these in here as well. And since people are their best experts, I would like to introduce our panelists today, Professor Donna Mejia, Gina Atkins, and Joey Ha. So I would like to hand the microphone off to Professor Mejia.
Thank you very much, Aja Mejia, and thank you to the entire community for the invitation to join you today. I'm coming to you from University of Colorado Boulder / bedroom during the pandemic. I'm an associate professor for the theater and dance department. I'm also with women and gender studies and ethnic studies, and it's wonderful to be in conversation with you. I wanted to let you know there are I have about half an hour to visit with you about some of my research. Exotification and fetishization, let's see how many times I can say that quickly, is a very delicate topic for me personally, as I have been subjected to it, and it is the actual family history that we come from. And so some of this is going to veer off of just research and give you a little bit of backstage pass to personal stories. I do want to also give some trigger warnings. If you'll allow me to share my screen, we'll go from there. So today I'm going to be addressing just the US history given that all geographic regions have their own history around exotification and the exploitation of people. I am coming to you from Boulder, which is in the Eno Heiau, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations, according to the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. And in addition to that, the 48 tribes that make up the lands that are the state of Colorado. But even one more thing, if I may, tribute to my own people, the Choctaw of Mississippi and the Coushatta of Alabama, that have now been split into 3 different tribes between Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas. These tribes were in coalition with my African ancestors whom were subjected to slavery. Everything that I try to do in my education and my scholarship deals with racism on 4 different levels: the personal level, the interpersonal level, the communal reflection, and the structural and systemic things that we negotiate as we try to live whole lives. In what I'm about to offer, I want to pledge that I will be encouraging and humorous in my offerings. I will explain thoughtfully and clearly. I will offer attribution and citation for what I have learned and concede openly what I have not yet learned. I will ensure a welcoming and judgment-free, inviting environment where counterpoint ideas can be exchanged diplomatically. Our discussion will welcome new ideas and perspectives. I promise you that I will remain open and receptive to these concepts changing and transforming based on your information as well. I welcome you to please let me know if you see glaring holes in my research, because I'm an advocate for intellectual humility. I intend to give you tools to increase your conversancy, expand your boundaries, and nurture independence. I have no interest in telling you what to think. Please know that instead, I'm very passionate about helping you to ask better questions without interference from socially indoctrinated filters, and we all have them. I will respect our differences in and out of this conversation because your dignity and comfort are important to me. And in return, I ask for your courage, diplomacy, open thinking, and active involvement. I hold myself accountable to the same standards and caliber that I am requesting of you. And my pronouns are she, they. Our trigger warning for today. Involved in our conversation are the histories of sexual servitude, slavery, misogyny, which I misspelled there. I apologize for not catching that typo before going live. Pornography, rape culture, and racial and sexual violence. I came to this from a personal history. These are members of my Creole family. Everyone that you're seeing on the screen is identified as African American. Specifically, my own birth certificate states that I am Negro. I have blue eyes, I have fair honey-colored skin, and I have very light brown natural hair. These things are, as of 1969, still considered quote unquote Negro. My appearance is frequently unsettling. I'm a woman with 6 known ethnicities and a greater number of unknown ingredients in my DNA. This manifestation of blue eyes and light colored skin and hair means that I'm routinely confronted with the question, what are you? This and numerous other microaggressions I experience in the classroom and boardroom give me a distinctive vantage point that renders visible how profoundly wounded and compromised we are in collectively addressing the legacy of colonialism, slavery, genocide, racism, and more in education. I'm not going to try to bypass my identity ambiguity. I've learned that it is pointless and people will not let it go because it has been exotified. I've chosen instead to fly my freak flag sky high. I'm going to embrace the relentless social confusion that my appearance provokes and welcome the weirdness. So I would like to start by briefly summarizing colorism within North America's African descended communities and the colonialist legacy fueling the common reactivity to multi-ethnicity. Then I'll share some tools and practices that have helped me. My own positionality is that I inhabit a middle ground in the binary of Blackness and whiteness, but even this is not fully representative because neither of my parents is white. I was raised by multi-heritage Creole parents from Louisiana and Mississippi. Initially poor, they uplifted themselves to middle-class citizenship. I am the first in my immediate family to achieve an advanced degree. I live in an area that supports freedom of religious and non-religious political and sexual preference expression, and I'm a cisgendered woman. I'm never challenged on my own heteronormativity, and I frequently remind myself of what my life would be like otherwise. My past includes experiences of domestic violence. I am demographically minoritized in my own home community, as most of my neighbors, co-workers, and students are European American. To counter this geographic isolation, I would frequently travel to locations inhabited mostly by people of the global majority. I have frequently learned that my presence was often tokenized and passively aggressively unwelcomed. I've experienced reprimands and sabotage if I demonstrated ascendancy from my supposed place in the race and power hierarchy, as another case of pet to threat in most professional situations. There is a constancy to the aggressions I field from both white and Black citizens, colleagues, public patrons, students. Fortunately, I feel strongly supported in my work by a crucial number of colleagues and supervisors. But to be honest with you, the amplification of the Black Lives Matter movement during the pandemic has been so monumentally important because it exposes a hegemonically subordinated narrative, how pervasive inequity and racism still are. I wish to complicate the conversation though, as we frequently deal with the Black Lives Matter movement as you either are or you aren't, and examining the gray zones in between and the middle citizenship, which was described by Professor Homi Bhabha in his third space theories, will be very important for us to understand what it is like to inhabit the center and the ways in which our identities have been exotified. I was taught that in the 1970s, multi-heritage citizens of New Orleans were called Creoles. This is from my family history. A word, Creole, is derived from the Spanish verb crear, to create. The nomenclature Los Criollos, the created ones, was imported from Caribbean slave owners. African-American Creoles were originally free people and were not subjected to slavery. Their African parents, though, were not. Mixed women, and often men, were often exotified and occasionally arranged into sexual servitude to white men. It created grave power differentials and injustices within African-descended families. Children were often raised by single mothers under great strain. Creole children were often unacknowledged and regarded as illegitimate by their white fathers. They were frequently born of rape. Creoles were also subjected to hostilities from white women whose husbands begot children outside of their marriages. And in avoidance of the South's one-drop rule that if you had one drop of Negro blood, you were classified as quote unquote a Negro, many Creoles made extreme efforts to escape the oppression by disconnecting from their families and trying to pass for white. This was received as a painful betrayal with African-descended communities. On the screen in front of you, the gentleman with the glasses, top left quadrant of your screen, is my grandfather, Grover Stewart, who did end up passing for white. Everyone else in the family chose to remain, quote unquote, loyal to the Black community, even though we frequently were treated with hostilities by the Black community. As we go into this discussion, what I think is very, very important for us to remind ourselves is that this conversation is going to treat biological sex, sexuality, gender identity, and gender expression as different things. Biological sex, defined by genitalia, with up to 10% of humans born with anomalies in their genitalia, and 1 to 2% of all humans born intersexed, exhibiting non-binary characteristics. I'm going to treat sexuality as a combination of romantic and/or sexual attraction behaviors that relate to whom you are attracted to, your health and reproductive patterns and beliefs, your own intimacy practices, and how you have been socialized. I will treat gender identity as the self-selected internal gender of an individual, which can be or not be aligned with one's biological assigned sex. And gender expression, the ways in which we enact our gender identity to others. I wish to talk about norms, because the norms by which we are socialized in our sexuality and the ways we begin to think of ourselves in either reproductive or expressive or erotic ways has to do with the collective norms of the society in which we are acculturated. And those norms are collectively constructed, affirmed, preserved, or subverted and defied, suppressed, innovated, reimagined on a perpetual basis. So I will give just a brief historic overview, knowing that within 30 minutes, it's impossible to give you a full accounting up to our present history, but I want to at least let you know where we started in this country. When we talk about norms, we're also talking about the social dynamics that drive the norms. And one of the tools that we have in our society for controlling behaviors is the idea of implicit bias. Now, implicit bias is not a known tool for everyone, because implicit bias refers to the attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in a very unconscious manner. It's kind of the way we've been steeped in these beliefs. And so it's important to consider how those conditioned attitudes about gender or sexual expression or race start to impact our view of dance traditions, individual movements, and our actual identities. These are taken from my dance classes, so you'll see a lot of quotes about movement in here. Stigma, a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. And specifically, it's a way of being or acting or choosing that is considered dishonorable. And participants who choose to participate in it must do the emotional labor of managing that social stigma for themselves. And that differs from the more extreme tool of things being taboo. Sorry for the glitch on the slides. I'm rewinding so we can get back to it. Taboo is the vehement prohibition of an action based on the belief that such behavior is either too sacred or too accursed for ordinary individuals to undertake. These prohibitions are present in virtually all societies, and violators may face significant consequences, legal punishment, or death. When it comes to exotified identities in the United States, specifically Black women, women of color, we dealt with not only the subjugation of our bodies, but the violent subjugation and exploitation of the Black female body as literally a breeder, chattel, property, tool, and toy. Those painful histories of how Black women were enslaved and had a complete erasure of their own personhood, and then being subjected to domestic violence at home at times, in addition to their places of, I was about to say employment, but forced employment, subjected to rape, femicide, which is basically sexual murder, and very brutal labor practices. The photo you have on your screen is from a nursemaid, a woman who was a nursing mother, but forced to give her milk to white children that she was a caretaker for, rather than to her own children who were forced to drink sugar water in the absence of her nourishment. This history of exotification is old. One of the most tragic stories that we know of in the exotification of Black and brown bodies is Sarah Bartman, who lived from 1789 to 1815. She was a South African woman who, with a very beautiful body, was exotified for the sculpture of her backside and the ampleness of her figure. She was toured to England and put on different stages. And there was actually a lawsuit that was filed by British abolitionists who argued that her performances were indecent and that she was being forced to perform against her will, because people were able to see her for a fee, but they were also able to touch her for an additional fee and touch her genitals and other parts of her body for additional monies. The court actually ruled in favor of her exhibition, fully dehumanizing her, because the man who was her caretaker, Dunlop, claimed that he had a contract which he produced in court. Given that she didn't speak much English and didn't read English, it is doubtful that the contract was actually real. She continued to be displayed in country fairs and then was sold to a Mr. Rowe in France, who raped her and impregnated her. The child was named Okura Rowe, and she died at the age of 5. Sarah herself lived in poverty and died in Paris of an inflammatory disease in 1815, but her caretakers were very wealthy. She did not see the wealth of the exhibitions that she was part of. After her death, her body was actually, it's hard for me to talk about, I'm sorry. Her body was dissected. And for a century and a half, visitors to the Museum of Man in Paris could view her brain, her skeleton, and her genitalia as a plaster cast also of her body. Her remains were finally dignified with a proper burial in South Africa in 2002 for South Africa's National Women's Day. The history of Black women not having full ownership of their bodies was then flipped historically in the United States and actually turned into a weaponized identity when women did engage in sexuality. And so we had the idea of the Jezebel, the portrayal of Black women as lascivious as a stereotype, that they were seductive, alluring, worldly, beguiling, tempting, but above all, lewd. And that white women as a category were portrayed as models of self-respect, self-control, and modesty, and even purity. But Black women were counter-portrayed as promiscuous and even predatory. And so they were seen as sexual deviants who would fulfill any and all sexual fantasies and whores. They were pure commodities. This is what women had to fight to have even a sense of sovereign control for their brown and Black bodies. So if we take this history and look at the legal things that were being done, the legacy of this sexual violation and the manipulation of African families still haunts the USA. It's very substantial in that the ambiguity of our identities is nothing new. People have never been able to quite figure us out. And so there were things like the paper bag rule or the one drop rule, where people were judged as Black as long as, for example, their skin was darker than a brown paper bag. Or if it were lighter than a brown paper bag, they were exotified as desirous and interestingly exotic. Or the one drop rule, as we talked about, if you had one drop of Black blood, you would be classified as Negro. African descended communities haven't had a moment's rest to truly unpack the legacy of colonialism, genocide, slavery, and dehumanization, and our transgenerational trauma and our interrupted lines of cultural transference manifest in multiple ways. Colorism is one of our most disorienting forms of internalized racism, interweaving classism, biological, and cultural racism as well. It represents the unimaginable pain each family had to navigate, frequently with conflicting survival responses and defenses, even within a single generation of a household. The slow legal acknowledgement of multi-ethnic citizens in the USA evinces a collective desire to avoid the socio-political and moral questions that our existence provokes. It would take until 2000 for the US Census to account for multiple categories of ethnic belonging. From 1790 to 1950, census takers determined the race of the Americans they counted, sometimes taking into account how individuals were perceived in their community or using rules based on their share of what they thought of as Black blood. Americans who were of multiracial ancestry were either counted as a single race or classified into categories that mainly consisted of gradations of Black and white. Americans could choose their own race only in 1960. And since 2000, they have had the option to identify with more than one ethnicity. And currently, the demographic acknowledgement of multi-heritage citizens has not equated to clarifying or deconstructing the stereotypes and the caricatures they face as sexually unique, desirable objects for collecting by white men. Within our own family history, my great-grandfather, I'm told, was a Rothschild, one of the inheritors of the Jewish banking empire, and that he moved to Mississippi in order to gamble away the inheritance that he received at a young age. And he would go to the Mississippi gambling boats to drink and gamble the night away. My great-grandmother was his maid, Bertha Anderson. She ended up bearing 3 children for him by rape against her will, but sheltering there in the house in the back room with her children and then cleaning his house when he was gone to the night boats to gamble. He one day sent a telegraph to the house, and please forgive my language. He said, "I'm bringing home a wife. You and your nigger babies need to leave the house." She fled the home with her 3 children and raised them independently. So on that side of the family, we don't even know his name. I don't know my great-grandfather's name. It was never spoken. It was forbidden. He was dishonored in our lineage. What I do know is I was raised with love, and I've tried to break that cycle of violence and exotification. It's very old though. And it started, actually, our US history started 4,000 to 7,000 years ago in the Neolithic era. And if that sounds like I'm getting a little unfocused, just bear with me for just a few seconds here. Because what we know from archaeology is that women led public rituals of religion throughout the agriculturalized world in the Bronze era. Here are some of the architectural relics and archaeological relics that have been preserved. So you see women playing drums and dancing and singing as public officiates of spiritual ceremonies. They were also in charge of the temples and received all of the tithing that would happen at temples to a female god. When patriarchy started to gain traction and the Indo-European invasion started to fight against matriarchal religions, that's when we started to see the vilification of the female body as subservient to a male god rather than as a representative of female deity. And as history would march forward, this vilification of the female body as wanton, as disruptive, as distracting, as problematic for noble men would follow us into the exotification of Black and brown bodies. But Black and brown bodies were not seen as symbols of divinity. They were seen as areas that were exploitable for the preferences of whomever had access to them. This exotification would actually become formal science in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The origins of the field of anthropology were actually originally ethnopornography and xenological erotica. In the 19th century, the European bourgeoisie overcame their own inhibitions by displacing their fantasies and notions of exotic cultures far from home. That's from Irving Schick in 1999. The first 50 anthropological surveys were only about women's bodies, and they were produced over a 20-year time frame starting in 1822. And the first common domain appearance of a bare-breasted woman was of an African woman in National Geographic in 1896. It sold out right away, and National Geographic realized that they could make all of their money quickly by featuring Black and brown bodies exposed. There was explosive popularity of Eastern travelogues in the 1800s that was sparked by Ottoman harems and fascinations with polygamous practices, which were rare. There was the burgeoning image of the belly dancer from Badia Masabni, a Syrian woman who started a nightclub in downtown Cairo in 1926, where she took her regional dancers, singers, and musicians and had all the women don Western bras that were jeweled, skirts, and high heels instead of the full tunic length belly attire of the culture. And this would be popularized for the British expatriates living in Cairo, thereby appealing to the Western gaze. So the brown bodies being fashioned to appeal to the Western gaze. And the image on the lower left-hand quadrant of your screen is from Karl Heinrich Stratz's book in 1911, where he did a measurement of vulva to breast ratios on different Black and brown women and compared them to the ectomorphic bodies of European American women as the standard of beauty. So again, this was put forth as official science, as academic science for a 20-year time frame. So is it any wonder that we had trouble unraveling our notions of humanization of human beings from science and from these terrible things? When Thomas Edison introduced his notion of film to the West, here's how he did it. He put a film of Fatima Jamil in the news to say, this is film, isn't this incredible? But instead of actually just showing the film of her dancing, by the time it was released to the public, this is what it looked like. So give it just a moment. The movement of her hips and torso were considered unbecoming, and they were covered and censored with bars so that you could see the wonder of movement and understand the technology, but not actually see her body, as her body was considered indecent for the pure gaze of white citizens. This leads us to also the exotification of our Asian American women, when in 1945 and 1946, Congress enacted exceptions to national origin quotas of immigration so that World War II soldiers and veterans could bring back foreign spouses and fiancés they had met while serving in the military. So again, Black and brown bodies being used as chattel, being used as property, given exception when it is favorable to the pleasure of white men, and then being dehumanized when we became inconvenient or a burden of care. If we look at current trends in pornography, this exotification has not changed. This is from year before last, 2019 report from Pornhub. And if you look down the categories of the most searched terms in pornography, you'll see Japanese, Korean, Asian, ebony, Chinese, Latina, Indian, and joy being some of the top categories. And matter of fact, this is important for us to understand given what has just happened in the Atlanta shootings. An increase in 4 categories by Japanese women in the most searched terms of 2019 2 years before we would have the Atlanta shooting. To disconnect race and sexual violence is a delusion that we should not fall to. Knowing that I'm probably close to time or even over, that very rough summary points to one thing: the importance of our dignity, the importance for people to self-determine and to be allowed middle citizenship, to not be asked to deny any part of their heritage, and to know that they have the inherent right to be valued or esteemed, that it goes much deeper than just respectfully treating someone well. It goes to valuing their life, valuing it. I'll let you screenshot very briefly my website and resources for additional sources on this talk, and my own email. And I'm sorry that I may have lost track of time because I do get emotional about this topic. And so I am going to stop sharing my screen if you've had a chance to screenshot, and see if we have time to take questions on this very brief overview.
We'll have a time for discussion at the end.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, of course. If you don't mind, Professor, putting your links in the chat as well so that they're there for anyone who wants them. I'd like to hand it over to Gina and Joey to introduce themselves.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much for having us today. And thanks so much for the organizers for inviting us. And thank you so much, Professor Donna, for that really great presentation. Gina and I were talking about how much we were learning just from you, just from this. So we're really grateful for that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. While I do that, Gina, do you want to make a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Gina Atkins. I am a master's student at North Carolina State University, and I specifically study rhetoric and composition with a specific focus in anti-racist pedagogy and also just Asian American studies. And I also work with Joey.
So thanks, Gina. So Gina and I are part of Community Organizing for Radical Empathy. We are an agency that does DEI training, workshops, programs, and things like that. However, our root really is community organizing. So most recently, we organized the Stop AAPI Hate Rally in downtown Denver. Today, we're going to be talking to you about Asian fetishization. And similar to Professor Donna's presentation, there will be mentions of rape and the sexual conquest in our presentation. So just a quick trigger warning. We want to start out by laying something down in that fetishization is not a compliment. Yellow fever is not a compliment. So yellow fever, if you don't know what that means, it's defined as an obsession with engaging in romantic and sexual relationships with individuals of Asian descent. When someone comes up to me, or when white men say that they have yellow fever, it's not a compliment because it removes a person's actual characteristics, their uniqueness, only to be replaced by race and stereotypes associated with that race. Fetishization is rooted in racism, sexism, and classism, and it leads directly to violence. The idea that women should be any certain way, that they should be subservient to men in any certain way, and women not meeting up to that expectation leads directly to violence. And it's reported that 21 to 55% of Asian women have said that they experience physical and sexual violence by intimate partner. And I think it's really important to note right now with what had happened at Atlanta, with the shooting of the Asian woman at the Asian salons, that it is directly related to fetishization. The shooter had said that he had a sex addiction, and that's why he had targeted these areas. However, it's important to note that even though he said he had a sex addiction, he immediately thought of Asian women to be his targets. And it's important to ask why, which is what we're going to delve into today. Right now, we'd love for you to take a short poll, and Gina's going to be dropping it into the chat So if you could look at the chat and go ahead and open our Mentimeter. And basically, we're going to ask you, what are some common stereotypes you've heard about Asian women? Submissive, yes. Obedient. Hypersexual, quiet. Easy to marry, yes. Meek. Smart, quiet. Shy and sweet. Bad drivers, I've gotten that quite a bit. All right, we'll give it another 5 seconds. So if you have any other words, feel free to enter them. As you can see, submissive is the largest word, unsurprisingly. We have smart, passive, skinny, bossy. All right, thanks for sharing, folks. But I think this is a really great way to sort of look at how Asian women are being perceived and how that relates to fetishization. Oftentimes, when folks say they have yellow fever, the stereotypes associated with that, why they have yellow fever, are directly related to Asian women being subservient, Asian women being submissive, Asian women being folks that you want to bed because they are willing to be obedient and willing to please. However, again, it's important to note that these are stereotypes, they aren't true. Give me a moment to return to the presentation slides. So when we talk about Asian fetishization, it's key to note that it directly relates to Western imperialism. They go hand in hand. And it's important to note how Western imperialism has contributed to Asian fetishization and vice versa. Like exotification, like Professor Donna, these words make me stumble a bit because they're so big, but exoticizing and fetishizing Asian women contributes to the othering of Asians as a whole, which means that this is a form of dehumanization, and it helps justify Western imperialism when Asians are not seen as human or are seen as subhuman. Some examples are in World War II, when the Allied troops were in Japan in the Battle of Okinawa. It was reported that over 10,000 Japanese women were raped by the GIs. And when they were being occupied after the war, Japan was concerned of further rape. And as a result, they started the Recreation and Amusement Association, a government program, which recruited over 55,000 women to serve as sex workers. And some of them, yes, used to be sex workers themselves, but several of them were coerced. They did not give consent to serve as sex workers. And I think it's really important to note here when in our conversations that sex work is work. We respect that as a profession. However, it's really important to delineate sex work that is being done consensually and sex work that is being done because someone's coerced. And a lot of times this is what had happened, or this is what is currently happening in Asia, as many of these women are in these positions because they are in situations of desperation. They do not have the financials needed for survival. They're coerced into it, they're forced into it. During the Vietnam War, something to note is the My Lai massacre. And this is when 500 civilians were murdered by American forces, and the majority of the women and children were raped. It's important to note that the American forces tried very hard to cover this up. They tried very hard to cover this up because they knew it was wrong. However, when it was eventually brought to light, only 14 troops out of the 100+ soldiers that committed this massacre were charged. And this is the only massacre that we knew about. So if American forces were trying to keep these things under the wraps, how many more massacres happen that we don't know about? And this is just an example. These are just a few examples of how Western imperialism served as a vehicle to conquer and dominate Asian women, and how Asian women were just objects of conquest. So this is a photo of US servicemen walking into a government brothel in Japan. And when we talk about, so we're talking about globally, Western imperialism and how it relates to Asian fetishization. And now we want to bring it back home to nationally the US. And to really exemplify this sort of fetishization back in the US, we want to bring up the Page Act of 1875. This was the first federal restrictive immigration law in the United States. And it barred Chinese women from immigrating due to the assumption that they were all sex workers. It's important to note that in the actual language of the law, it didn't seem racist or sexist as much as saying they wanted to ban immoral folks from entering. So they would test all of these Chinese women to see if they could potentially be sex workers. And these tests included extensive interviews that repeated, and every little thing that seemed off to interviewers would mean that these Chinese women weren't allowed. They also included review of photographs of these women to check for prettiness, or to check for in their pose or in their look, how it might maybe indicate that they were a sex worker. And because of this, the majority of Chinese women that applied for immigration were unable to immigrate. And in 1880, almost 95% of the Chinese population in the United States was male. And this resulted additionally in the sex trafficking of more than 2,000 Chinese women just in San Francisco. And these women were sold at a wharf through auctions. So again, it's important to note how this fetishization of Asian women had started eons ago, ages ago, and it's not new. And although we'd like to say that we're beyond that, it has not gone away. Stereotypes still exist commonly in media and society. Most recently, the language surrounding the coronavirus, calling it the China flu, the Kung flu, and the Wuhan virus, directly impacted the recent spike in anti-Asian hate crimes nationally. It demonizes and ostracizes the Asian population, and unfortunately, Asian women are doubly affected as gender inequality increases due to COVID. This image right here is of a music video that was released just last year by a company advertising pelvic exercises and basically encouraging folks to do it so they could get a so-called Kung Fu Gina. And this entire music video was littered with a ton of common stereotypes of Asian women that Gina will now go into.
Thank you, Joey. Now what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about, I wouldn't say that these are 4 main stereotypes, but these are 4 very enduring and I would say popular stereotypes. And we're also going to talk about the historical context for them as well. They do definitely come at the intersection of race and gender, and also occasionally class as well. So we're just going to get into these. So the first one is the Dragon Lady. She is someone who is known as dark, cold, a malicious force. She's also seen as someone who is strong, deceitful, domineering, mysterious, and also very sexually alluring as well. And usually this is a trope that is aimed towards specifically East Asian women, but also sometimes women of South Asian and Southeast Asian descent as well. They also are seen as someone who could potentially use their alluringness or sexuality for personal gain. And we can see this from what Joey said earlier about the Page Act of 1875, which was specifically to bar Chinese women. And this came several years before the Chinese Exclusion Act. itself, which eventually ended up banning Chinese men as well. But we also see this in the media during the time. So there is a popular cartoon that came out called Terry and the Pirates, which was created by cartoonist Milton Caniff, who is a white man. I want to add to that. And he created it because he was just really fascinated by pirates, and he had heard these like tales and stories about, female pirates who were able to be domineering and also who were able to sexually seduce others to get their way. And so he decided he wanted to create a comic strip about that was running in the, I believe, Chicago Tribune. And due to this and other things in the media, in the 1930s, we see the phrase dragon lady become very popular in the English vernacular. It was also popularized by a lot of silent films at the time. And there was also one particular star, Anna May Wong, who popularized that because she starred in a lot of silent movies and played the dragon lady type character. Of course, I also want to add that even if individuals such as Anna May Wong did portray characters that portray this stereotype, this is not saying anything about them as individuals. We're mainly just talking about the culture and society around that created this environment that flourished this stereotype. And so one example that I think we could see in modern times would probably be Lucy Liu in Kill Bill. She's definitely an example of what people would say is a dragon lady. And so moving on to the next one is the lotus blossom figure. So this is a figure who's seen as meek, submissive, and usually is a servicing white men. They're seen as sexually compliant, subordinate to good wives, good service members. They're also seen as pure and vaginal, and the historical context for this is seen from Chinese sex workers who are brought over to service white men. We also see this historically through comfort houses and comfort women, historically from World War II. And so that's just a little bit of where that comes from. And then when it comes to media that showcases this, we see this most popularly in this opera called Madame Butterfly, where in this story, which is an opera that is based on, that is also a play and also a book, it's shown that basically the character, she kills herself when her male lover leaves her. And then we also see this continuing, the story of the lotus blossom figure continues on in other media such as Miss Saigon, which might be something that you've heard of because it is a retelling of Madame Butterfly, but it is based in the Vietnam War. And if you haven't heard of Miss Saigon, I will just add that it is Broadway's 13th longest running musical. So it is very enduring and the music is very popular. And so it is just something that continues to live in our culture. Next, we're going to be talking about someone that you might not have heard of before, or maybe you have. This stereotype is called Susie Wong from The World of Susie Wong. And so basically what it is, it's a 1960s romantic drama film, which was adapted from a 1957 novel of the same name by Richard Mason, who I'll also add is also a white man. I know that is very important to add for all of this. And it's basically about the idea of a hooker with a heart of gold. She was a smart, successful sex worker living in Hong Kong. She ends up being the muse and the love interest for this white artist in Hong Kong at the time. And then towards the end of the movie, she's able to leave her quote unquote tragic life to be with that man and move to America. And another thing, interestingly enough, is that the plot works itself out in a way that she is able to leave for America with him, because technically she's working in this bar. She has very horrible customers occasionally. She also has a child who ends up dying at the end of the movie. Not much of a spoiler alert because I wouldn't recommend it, but yeah, the child ends up dying at the end of the movie, and this frees her up to be able to go with her white savior back to America. And it really showcases a stereotype that Asian women are subservient and that they will assimilate to anything and that they can quickly move from their homes to America. And so it really just pressures Asian American women into adopting the Susie Wong complex of assimilation. And we see this in a lot of cultures as well, especially for diasporic communities, that assimilation is seen as a survival tactic, but it is also here being promoted as a positive attribute instead of a coping mechanism. And then finally, another figure that might be very popular or well known is the geisha figure. They're usually seen as sexualized, exotic, and extremely erotic. They're also similar to the lotus blossoms servicing white men. in an entertaining context. And so the historical context for that is the fact that American GIs took part in comfort women that were provided by Japan, and they brought the concept back. And we also see this in human trafficking as well. Another interesting thing is that historically geishas were not originally seen as sexual figures. They were actually purely for entertainment. They were seen as just dancers, and also at various points in history, they were rather not popular and just seen as like, poor entertainment. And at some point they did gain more popularity, but there's actually rules in geisha culture that they were not supposed to do sex work, which is an interesting thing. And so it is really interesting that, and that's not to say that some didn't, because some did engage in sex work, but it is interesting that the culture itself is not primarily centered around sex work, but now it is conflated with sex work. And we probably see this most popularized in the book and movie Memoirs of a Geisha. The movie, which was directed by Steven Spielberg, ended up getting a lot of awards. The book, which is also written by a white author, Arthur Goldstein, I believe, that's also been interesting as well. And he was inspired to write the book in the first place, just because he had studied in Asia and he was just really interested in the idea of prostitution in Asia. And we see this stereotype enduring as well through all of the really bad Halloween costumes that we see. Whenever someone wants to dress or appear like they are Asian, they usually take on traits of the geisha, such as the white face powder, the makeup, the red lipstick, and also the use of kimono. And so that's just an enduring stereotype that we see as well. And so as you probably noticed, they all overlap with one another, and they do definitely intersect between race, sexuality, and class as well. And so it's just a reminder that this does have genuine ramifications. Like, even though these stereotypes, we don't walk out on the street and say like, hey, she's a geisha figure, hey, she's a dragon lady. Even though these might not be in the forefront of our minds when we are thinking about stereotypes, they do genuinely have ramifications when they are saturating our media and saturating the discourse around Asian women and their sexualities. It's objectifying them, it is dehumanizing them, it is removing their agency as individuals and as people. And it also just allows situations to occur where, because they're dehumanized and objectified and commodified, they're then seen as objects that violence can be done upon, because they are not conflated with other types of women. And so, like we said at the beginning, fetishization is not a compliment, because it is rooted in racism, sexism, and classism, and it does have genuine ramifications for the world and for these women.
So we encourage you to keep in touch with us. That was our presentation. We're excited to take some questions. To keep in touch, you can email us at that email, visit our website, and also follow us on social media. So thanks again to the organizers for putting all this together, and hopefully we are on time.
Yeah, y'all are all good. I want to say thank you to everyone for the information that you presented today. This is our discussion / Q&A period.